Hello, everyone. Welcome to this next episode of the Social Club at the End of the World. And I'm calling this episode 5 on a series within the series called Focusing on Guy McPherson's Latest Predictions. Though, of course, we go far beyond that. I want to welcome Dan in Chicago, Doctorus Newtopia in Tucson, Arizona, Jason in Long Beach, California, and I want to cordially welcome myself, Jamin Shively from Seattle, Washington. We've got a little bit of an agenda here, starting with Love at the End of History, followed by Global Dimming, followed by Arcologies for the Future, followed by Hoarding, followed by Censorship. So kind of a busy agenda today, so we're going to try to keep it rolling. And as always, we welcome everyone's comments on YouTube. We always read the comments. We respond to most of them, and you're definitely having an impact. So please keep commenting, questioning, etc. And also feel free to say, hey, can I join the Social Club at the End of the World? Can I join one of your hangouts? We're very open to that as well. So welcome, everyone. And Doctorus, I'll pass it to you to kick us off on Love at the End of History.
So love is a very complex emotion. It seems to resonate in every cell of our being, and we have 50,000 cells. It gives electricity. It ignites movements. It is the creator of cities. And there is this partnership that happens between women and men to build these cities. But if we look at how this civilization began, it began through male domination. Before there was this Western type civilization, there was a goddess culture. And that culture, they lived together, they worshiped the earth. There wasn't the kind of hoarding that we'll be talking about of, this is mine, these are my children, this is my property. That was not the kind of civilization that Western civilization evolved from. So males started coming into their power and revolting against the mother culture, the wisdom culture. And now we're in a patriarchal dominated society. We have the skyscraper, the symbol of male power. And then we have the domestic architecture, the place where women have been enslaved to, the kitchen or the family. And we're coming, women are saying, nope, we don't want this anymore. And we're at this point of developing a new kind of civilization. Then we get into mythopoetics, you know, the new Eve, the new Adam, the story of Lilith. And there are other creation stories that manifest. So in this new civilization type, in order to get us there, we're looking at different roles. What are the different roles that people play that evolves our culture? And Jamin, in your way of thinking, you know, it's and this marketing thing that you talk about, you know, oh, it's the first. If you're the first, then you've got, you know, then you're in the position of power. And I guess I've had some difficulty with some of this, and especially this whole metaphor that you've used with me of the new Eve, and then your girlfriend, the new Eve. So that is difficult for me on a psychological level. You know, what is my role? You know, how much intimacy can I have with you? You know, how, you know, what, you know, I'm not the one that's really having the conversations in a way that my ideas I feel, can be listened to. So, you know, this whole love thing is very problematic, and it creates some kind of division. It's a hierarchical situation. And I'm learning to deal with it, you know, my own singularity, and not wanting to be part of a patriarchal structure. And, you know, is marriage part of that? Or is coupling part of that? Or are we going into a partnership society where the partner is the nucleus? The partner is the way that every other role kind of manifests around. And from there, then the new city can arise. These are the kind of questions I think are, they're really deep and esoteric, because love is a very esoteric thing. It's not an external power. It's internal. And, you know, it also deals with erotic. And there is a power to the reproductive metaphor. Now, I think that the reproductive metaphor is changing, and that, or what we need now is more that reproductive metaphor that creates cities, that creates this equality between the sexes, that allows for us to build the new civilization type. And that is what I'm interested in. To me, that's where the energy is, the power, the radiation from the heart that creates the lovolution. I'm very glad that your partner is starting to be on your hangouts, and you know you're bringing her in. You know, and perhaps that's the nucleus. You know, I need a nucleus. I need something like that. But since it has not happened in my life, this true love phenomena, then I have to do it singularity. I have to do it singularly. You know, there's no more heartache in my life, room for heartache in my life. And perhaps this is just, you know, the way it is. I mean, in my original thinking about how civilizations happen and the mythopoetics of it is that, okay, you have this prophet. You know, we're talking about a massive cultural change. It is some kind of prophecy of the future. And it has to be, you know, very clear, like a channel. It's an earth channel. That's what the vision is, to find these pieces of the puzzle to build this certain new kind of civilization. And then there is, and I've lost my train of thought. You know, so this connection between the sexes, that's like the energy that makes this whole thing happen. I think that's what happened with Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that was an erotic image. And without her, unfortunately, they did not know how to treat her because it became a patriarchy. Then that's what created Christianity. That's how the myth spread. That's how the community was formed, through that kernel. Because religions require the women's role. You can't do it without it. So, you know, patriarchy cannot work without that. And it has to be this erotic partnership. So anyway, that's the basis of my Lovolutionary thought. and what lacked at so many of these intentional communities, and what did not occur at Arcosanti. In fact, Soleri has now been called out as being a sexual predator. And his daughter said that that's even why it did not manifest. So this true love thing, I think is what creates history and what moves us beyond it.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all I'll say.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts listening to what you were saying, doctors. The issue of erotic energy or attraction, when it comes to sexuality, which ultimately leads to or can lead to reproduction, etc., and can form the basis of a lot of bonding. One of the things that's not usually highlighted about it is that in order for something to be erotic, it allows for, in a sense, the suppression or the repression of other reactions. So when you're talking about physical sex, if you really think about it, without erotic energy, that kind of close contact will lead to a feeling of disgust and an anxiety about contamination. And so when you look at different forms of sexuality, homoerotic, classical reproduction, sex for reproductive purposes, and everything under the sun. What is often missed is that when you are engaging in a state, you're in a state where you have the erotic energy. You are able to have certain kinds of contacts with other human beings that without that eroticism, you can't have it. You will, and that gets in, and that's why you have a lot of problems. For example, if somebody's orientation is, I'm simplifying it, but say gay sexuality, somebody who does not have erotic energy in that direction is going to find that kind of contact to be disgusting. And you see this kind of a thing manifest throughout the culture without people really understanding what, even really what's going on with that. And the other thing about erotic energy, it always encapsulates a very fundamental emotion, which sometimes is called interest excitement. And this emotion is all about getting something, taking something, doing something, usually connected with drive states in some sort of a way. And when you are in that emotional state, whatever it is you're needing or focusing on seems all good, all important, all necessary. And any anxiety or shame about the consequences of pursuing it are essentially suppressed so that it facilitates action. And in our culture today, again, when you have this very, very high consciousness at this point in time for a number of reasons about sexual predators or people taking advantage of their position of power for sexual purposes. They are essentially going into this interest excitement state. And when they are in that state, they do not have the normal anxiety or shame reactions, shame, guilt, or anxiety, which would normally give a person an inhibition about stepping forward and maybe doing something that's going to be harmful or offensive to someone else. And people are not taught to understand that, and to understand that you have to be able to control these energies and these emotions. And I know that in our culture, our society, people learning in a really important, fundamental way to manage interest, excitement, which feels good. It gives you, a dopamine rush usually, and some other very reinforcing neurochemicals. So, when we're talking about people coming together, having attachments, a feeling of togetherness and respect, being able to control love. I mean, love is a beautiful thing, no doubt about that. But at the same time, it also is associated with a lot of negatives that come into play with human beings: jealousy, envy, control, all of these things. And I do think it's not really what we're specifically talking about in a way here, but I do think that it's very important that these mechanisms that operate, they're hardwired in. Everybody experiences it, knows, if they really think about it, what's going on. How many relationships have been ruined, just because somebody is carrying on a flirtation at work or in a bar somewhere, where there's drinking going on, and they end up having a sexual, brief sexual relationship. Somebody becomes attached. It ruins so many, can ruin potentially so many other relationships and things. And there isn't really a reflection by most people of what it is they're letting, they're actually doing or what's happening to them. I'm going to go. I just want to throw that in there because it came to me when you were talking about it, and I'm going to go ahead and mute out. Thank you.
Yeah, love can drive people crazy, and because it's so much energy. And like you said, if we're not taught to really understand that energy or to control it and to be able to use it for the purpose of building community. And then it can wreck communities. I mean, it can just wreck everything. And in a way it is anyway, because in a patriarchal society, we build a certain kind of architectural structure. We have the automobiles that support that in order, these houses where people can have sex or, have this American dream and reproduce in this certain way. And so it's just been frustrating to me because, I have a lot of love I want to give and these ideas and not be able to fully express it because I don't have that partner. It's not this is not fully, developed idea, of the Lovolution and how it could create Arcologies. So I have to just deal with it. This is how I'm dealing with it, is having, opening up the house and having potlucks and, and dealing with the sorrow, like, okay, I wasn't selected on a sexual or metaphysical sex level, to be this kernel. And I have been put down so much with the Arcology people, with, just the way it is. And so I'm dealing with my frustration, the best way I can. And I don't know, and Jamin, you have to be really careful, like with women like me. You don't go around saying, oh, maybe we're the new Adam and Eve. And then you say it with your girlfriend. It's not a wise thing to do. And there's frustration because, okay, we were doing the Maskgasm show. Well, the purpose of Maskgasm is to create the orgasm, the explosion that allows this mass movement to exist in a way that could build the network of arcologies. So that's all I'm going to say right now about that.
I wanted to jump in here. You guys can't see me, huh?
No.
Not at the moment.
All right, my phone has decided that the camera does not work. So I was just going to say that, you know, I know you spent some time, doctors, at Acrosante, and I had read an article about intentional communities, and one of them that they mentioned was in, I want to say, like Portugal or Spain, and it was a free love intentional community. Have you heard of that one?
Tamara. Yeah, I've been
Tamara.
there, and what they deal with is they have almost nobody partners there. If you come as a partner, you're probably not going to end as one. And you follow your sexual impulse, whatever that is, whoever you want to combine your energies with, you know, you go ahead and do it. And then because of the jealousy issue, which arises because of this attachment that people have to certain people and not letting the energy flow because of, you know, coupling, how they deal with that is they have a forum. And that when people have a problem with jealousy or whatever issue they have within this intentional community, they get together, they act it out, what the problem is, and then those people involved look at the actors and see, well, you know, maybe I shouldn't be acting that way. Or maybe, you know, I need to control myself more, or maybe I'm obsessing, or whatever it is. And that's how they have dealt with the problem of community, sexuality, and jealousy. And Dr. Dieter Doom is one of the founders of that community. And he says that after he's experimented with communities for, I don't know, 50 years. And he was a psychotherapist or a psychologist or something like that. And he feels that jealousy is the worst thing to deal with in a community. And I mean, I've tried to start communities before, you know, with men, and, you know, being the person that is not the main partner. And I don't know, so far I haven't really liked that role that much. And I don't know.
Tamara, I found, was interesting because, you know, I have a 1-year-old daughter, and I found in there that it explained that when they're, you know, they stay with the parent until they're about 2 years old, and then they sort of are actually more raised in more of a communal sense by the community, as opposed to solely by one or two parents who are together as a couple, that the community sort of raises these kids. And I thought that that was interesting because you were talking about patriarchy and having ownership over the partner or the children, for instance. Oh, these are my children. So I guess if Tamara is something more of what you think is necessary for humans to get past the patriarchal, male-dominated society, I think it would be very difficult to take modern humans today with the way we have our society constructed, with the way we have, you know, relationships between a man and a woman, and they're supposed to, you know, these things that are very embedded and ingrained in our society today that, you know, that is a task unto itself to try to battle. I guess battle wouldn't be the right term, to try to overcome that and replace it with a more free love thing where there's more of a balance between the male and female energies. I find that very interesting, and I hear where you're coming from. But I see that there is many hurdles in trying to get a society like Americans to make a transition into a free love kind of society. And I guess that's all I have to say. But I thought that that mentioning Tamara in this whole thing was an interesting perspective on love.
Absolutely, and Dieter Doom is just a genius as far as that goes, and he's written some great books on this topic of love and politics, because what we're talking about is really love and politics combined when you're talking about partnership. Partnership is a political, act, as well as being drawn in through, erotic love. So it really is the religion and political system, and how to transform that or make it function. I think looking at Tamara is a good start, and their collective child rearing is really necessary for parents to feel free. And see, that's what they're trying to do, because a lot of these coupling that happens in our culture, it gets stuck. That's why so many relationships just kind of get into a groove, and not much creativity can happen.
I think. Go ahead, Jason. I'm going to mute out.
I was just going to say that, that's part of the problem I think we see in either our country or definitely our country, is you see articles all the time about how young kids in schools in inner city areas like Chicago, Detroit, we could name a bunch more, probably even Los Angeles. The parents work full time, both of them, barely have enough money to pay the rent and buy the food for the kids. You have kids starving, go to school hungry, and our school systems can't even provide them with just a simple, decent meals. So we literally have a situation in our country where we live in the wealthiest country in the world, and we can't seem as a community to come together and feed children. There's something gotta be wrong with us if we can't even feed the starving children in our society. It's horrible. So I think there's definitely something to learn, but that also comes in with the masculine domination in our current culture, but also the cult of the self. All the Republicans and conservatives that seem to love Trump in this country, it's all, we shouldn't feed these children. They're not our children. They need to flip their own bill and start working and make money to buy their food. And you're like, but they're 5 years old, so it's we definitely completely lack any community structure. And I find it amazing because sometimes I'll say this on Facebook in a comment or something like that, and people will be like, well, who do you surround yourself with? Because obviously it's not very quality, good people. And I'm like, I don't think you understand what you consider a community is a very dysfunctional community. That talking to your neighbor once in a while and showing up to their kid's birthday party is not community. So I think people in the United States especially have a confusion of what community really is. I'm going to mute out.
Just one quick point. Bringing Guy McPherson and his recent fall from grace with a lot of people, where, what he essentially was putting forth was, again, a theory, a hypothesis about exponential climate change, everything that's going to happen as a result of that. That's just simply something which is very rational. It can be refuted, it can be debated, it can be discussed. But what seems to have happened, and I don't know a lot about it, but essentially it appears that he became engaged, I thought, with a younger woman, perhaps from Australia or New Zealand, and they were engaging in erotic exchanges of a certain nature. And again, when you go into the erotic energy, it's very, very easy, and it's really almost normal for attachments to be formed. And if there isn't a mutual understanding about that reality, then people can become very, very upset and angry. And I think that, you know, it just shows you the power of these issues, that people who were, I guess, formerly a part of Guy McPherson's, you know, community and supporters over this dispute where Guy McPherson was essentially being viewed as a, maybe not quite this strong, but kind of in the framework of a sexual predator, and without really, again, any kind of realistic discussion about what is the nature of all of this. And I think that one last thing, and I'll get out of, I'll mute out. You know, I see today, you know, because my background is mental health, and I've been involved, you know, academically or in one way or another with mental health and psychology since the 1970s for sure. And what you know has never really been adequately discussed in the culture is that the whole, you know, Donald Trump today is being talked about as if he has mental health problems, you know, that and a group of psychoanalytically oriented you know, psychiatrists recently came out with a book analyzing what's wrong with Donald Trump on a mental health basis, and that he should be removed, and so on. And most of these concepts that are being applied to Donald Trump and all sorts of other people, you know, in a frivolous fashion, really, are rather they're unsound. They are not valid concepts. And you know, I just would say that, you know, we already in recent times, when the Soviet Union was in place, and the very kinds of mechanisms that are starting to come to the forefront with all of the political problems and that we have today in the United States, where suddenly, you know, you're going to have, as I often say, in the Soviet Union, they used to have a diagnosis called sluggishly progressive schizophrenia, which meant that you were delusional because you did not see the Soviet Union as a perfect or soon to be perfect society. You were a dissident. And they would simply remove these people when they became too salient with their criticisms into a psychiatric unit, and they would inject them with antipsychotic drugs. And so I think that, you know, in a sense, we really have to, whether it's talking about love, erotic energy, and many other things, you know, be able to break it down in a way which is grounded in some sense on evidence and you know, and reliability. I'm going to mute out. Thank you again for bearing with.
Yeah, I think the you know, a lot of erotic energy is unconscious. We don't know how to talk about it. It's something that women just have gone along with, and you know, that really needs to be analyzed much more consciously about our motivations and where this energy leads us and how we deal with it, and what is the evolution of this energy? How is it helping us to evolve? And I think that's what happened with Guy McPherson, is that he lost grace because perhaps he was not controlling his energy according to what, you know, have been the rumors about him. You know, I don't know if it's true or not, but gosh, that's, you know, it happens a lot, you know, that men go, when men and women, because it's both of them, just don't know how to deal with it. And you are so right that once you get into that erotic space with somebody, that when it doesn't work out, when your dreams or fantasies does not work out, it causes some pain.
And there's, if you go into erotic spaces with someone, there is a good possibility that attachments, which are really something different, it's not the same as erotic energy, get formed. And once you have an attachment formed and you are faced with the prospect of losing the attachment, the person, then you're going to go into a very negative emotional state that can be very, very powerful. And people are not responsible. So whether it's a man or a woman, if you were being, totally responsible, you would recognize always the risk of, if I go into an erotic space with someone, there may be, we both may become attached, or maybe only one of us will become attached. And of course, in the patriarchal orientation, men are socialized in a certain way to be resistant to allowing themselves, when it's sexual, necessarily to go into an attachment. And that can be very, very problematic. And men should be able to take more responsibility for that. But at the same time, women should appreciate how men, have been, a lot of men, not many men go into attachments very, very quickly through eroticism, and they're no different. But the thing is to be able to understand it and to kind of, hey, I got to take responsibility. If I'm in a certain situation and I'm about to enter into a sexual relationship, I have to understand it's not just about, hey, this is very attractive, it's going to feel good, I'm going to feel good afterwards, hopefully. But then there can be serious consequences. The person that you just had that erotic engagement with may become attached to you. You may become attached to them. And that may be a very complicated, difficult situation because of other attachments that people might have. And so, again, you can kind of see how in our culture, there's a constant concern with these issues, but they're not really discussed in a realistic way. And I couldn't help but note, with the sort of the Guy McPherson situation, where now Guy McPherson, who is, believing that time is unbelievably short, as he's still a human being, and he feels, that he's been treated unfairly, and so he's pursuing a lawsuit. And you'd almost say, why bother with a lawsuit at the end of the world? But we are human beings, and he wants justice in his mind. So again, I do think a lot of these things really get in the way of being able to focus on certain things, and they're very important in and of themselves. I'm going to mute out. Thank you again for.
Yeah, I just have one more comment about this, and it's just not sexual. Some people are more into erotic philosophic. And what I mean by that is that you join genius codes together. In order to build the arcology, you're going to have to come together with all these different people who study these different fields, and there's going to be this connection of geniuses. And that is, it's a higher realm of love than the physical. But the same kind of stuff happens, like the connections or the misconceptions or the abuse of power. So that's what I think that in our dealing with something as magnificent as building an arcology, we need to be extremely aware of. and have our mytho poetry flow. And now I really don't know what I'm talking about because it's never happened. So, you know, a lot of these things you got to experience it. And I haven't. So anyway, I'll shut up for now.
All right. Great stuff. Thank you for leading that discussion, Doctress. So we shift to the topic of global dimming. Are we ready to do that? Okay. So I wanted to give a brief update on what I found out about global dimming just this last weekend. One of the folks who posted a comment on one of our previous videos posted a link to a 1-hour documentary done by a British company on the topic of global dimming. And, you know, I used to think about global dimming as, you know, one of the various factors that's at play here. Coal burning power plants release, you know, sulfur particles and whatnot that are reflective, and whatever, you know, how big of a deal can. Well, it turns out that I learned from this documentary that the reflectivity of the particles themselves is a relatively small component of this larger thing called global dimming. The real biggie is that with all these contaminant particulates that we're pumping out into the air from automobiles, steel mills, coal burning power plants, et cetera, that these particles end up seeding clouds, right? So you got all this moisture in the air. If you put a bunch of particulates in that water gas, in the gas phase, the water molecules start to attach to these particulates and form droplets. So the particulates become sort of the nuclei for droplets. The bottom line is that the more of these contaminants that we're putting into the air, the more clouds form, the more droplets form, and it's the droplets that act as little mirrors that reflect away the sunlight. So we're reflecting away so much sunlight through this broader global dimming effect that if we were to suddenly turn off civilization and all those particles fall down, which they will, it's just gravity pulls them down. They're not gas, they're particles. They're solid particles, and solid particles fall. If they're really tiny, they fall very slowly because, you know, they're getting whipped around, just like you see dust particles in a dusty room that never seem to fall, but they are falling. If we shut off industrial civilization, we lose that global dimming effect, and we would see, the estimate is, a sudden spike of +3 degrees C immediately. So it's not a small spike in temperature due to removing the global dimming effect. It is a massive spike. And if you imagine adding +3 degrees C to our current +1 degrees C above pre-industrial baseline, that would put us at +4. And any scientist will tell you, if we're at +4 above pre-industrial baseline, forget it. It's an absolute vicious, hyper-accelerated runaway train of warming from that point forward. So global dimming is very, very serious. You know, therefore, shutting off industrial civilization would push us into that hyperheating state. And it's actually because of my learning about that I've actually had a bit of a shift in philosophy myself, and I now see this hyper warming, this transition to a hothouse state, as I would just call it all but inevitable at this point. You know, given the dozens of other self-reinforcing feedback loops that are already kicking in and weighing in a big way. You know, look at all the disasters in the last 12 months alone. I think, and that shift has got me thinking about our next topic, which I'll get to once everyone has had their say on this topic. But it's radically shifted my thinking in terms of how we need to how I think we should prioritize what we do. But anyway, any more comments or questions on global dimming?
Yeah,
basically, yeah.
Yeah, Jamin, one thing you mentioned, and in a way, it may or may not be really significant. The issue of where we're at in terms of temperature, average global temperature at this point in time relative to, say the 1750 pre-industrial baseline. And how, so for example, some people would say maybe we're at 1.5 or 1.6 centigrade right now above that baseline. And I think it's important because exponential climate change, which is undergirded by the self-reinforcing feedback loops. So if it's the case, and I don't know, I've stated this as if it were the case because I've heard it from, Guy McPherson, Paul Beckwith, other, have mentioned this. If it's the case that, let's say, from 1750, pre-industrial baseline, up until maybe the beginning of 2015, we went up 1 degree centigrade as far as average global temperature. And if it's the case that right now, as we sit here in the beginning of 2018, we may be at 1.5, 1.6, maybe some people say even a little bit higher. And there's a lot of, people can argue about how you measure it, where you measure it from, how much is, being absorbed in the ocean, et cetera. But the thing is, if you have gone up conceptually, let's say it was 1 degree beginning of 2015, and now we're at 1.5, 1.6, that is a very rapid increase in a very short period of time. And if that is true, if that's valid, that is something people are entitled to know, just to be aware of. And again, we seem to, kind of avoid that. And I think as far as global dimming goes, what you're saying, and I agree with this completely, that, and I think McPherson maybe has said, is that you cannot stop what we're doing, because if you do, then we're going to be cooked very, very rapidly. And on the other hand, if we don't stop what we're doing, unless there's some other kinds of interventions, we're going to exponentially, how many years that's going to take, we're going to be pushed across, the 3 degrees centigrade, 4 degrees centigrade. And I don't think anybody really makes a serious argument. If you cross over, say, 4 degrees centigrade, it's over. Anything that you really care about is over. And I just feel that people are entitled to know what's going on. It's not something that really, it is being censored. So people are allowed to say, well, maybe we're 1 degree, or they'll say we've gone up 1 degree since 1880, or there's all these different, kind of projections of where it's going to go. And without having it discussed and people allowed to understand what's going on, we end up, the population remains confused. And again, we'll listen to authority figures. So where do you, so you're saying you have a shift in your thinking, that you have now been moved to a slightly different place when you really assimilate the reality of global dimming and what's going on. So where have you shifted to?
Yeah, where I've shifted to is that if humanity does not figure out a way to basically replace that global dimming with some other form of geoshading, right? Let's just call the current global dimming, accidental, inadvertent global geoshading, right? Because nobody planned for it. Nobody said, hey, Henry Ford didn't say, hey, let's start the modern automotive industry so that we can have, global dimming. It just happened as an accidental, unintended consequence. And as it turns out, I mean, I actually believe we're alive today thanks to global dimming. If we didn't have global dimming, we would have kicked off runaway, climate change much, years ago, maybe even decades ago. So, if we don't replace that inadvertent, unintended global dimming with an engineered, designed, intentional global dimming, and we see a dramatic reduction in emissions, which lots of groups and governments and United Nations, et cetera, around the world are trying to do. One of the comments on one of our recent videos said, that when he talks to people about reducing emissions, he says, I dare you. If you reduce emissions, you're going to, get rid of the global dimming, and then we're really cooked. So my shift is really twofold. Number one, we've got to do some other form of geoshading to replace global dimming, as global dimming, peters out, as in either through emissions reductions or just collapse of industrial society. And the second shift is that we urgently need to prepare, and this gets to the next topic, that we urgently need to prepare for a hotter world. And there's, two crucial things that we identified in our late night discussion last night, the subject of the title of which, Homer's Ark, Arcologies for the Future. And we call it Homer's Ark because we envision building arcologies, heat-resistant, weather-resistant arcologies, designed to enable and empower humanity and many other species to live in the hothouse state we're heading towards. If we can build these arcologies, let's just call the hothouse state plus 10 degrees C above pre-industrial baseline, a very hot world, right? That would not support anywhere near the scale of modern agriculture that we have today. Maybe way up in the northern latitudes, you could still grow grain, but it might support a tiny fraction of the population we have today. And of course, if we go Mad Max and all these other catastrophic elements of heating that go along with heating, basically all bets are off for having any kind of ongoing, planetary modern civilization. So I think that our best chances for survival are building arcologies, heat-resistant, weather-resistant arcologies. Think like Biosphere 2. I mean, I'll invite especially Doctress in Utopia to weigh in because she's studied arcologies and is, as far as I'm concerned, an expert. But that's my vision, that we need to do this urgently. And the reason we call it Homer's Ark was because one of the initial motivations of creating these weather-resistant arcologies is so that we can have, some minimum population of humans in these arcologies, co-locate these arcologies near nuclear power plants so that these humans can have the mission of shutting down these nuclear power plants so that the 440 in operation today do not go Fukushima. So, rough back of the envelope, we build 440 arcologies, one for each nuclear power plant, co-located very nearby. And the mission of the people surviving in that arcology is to shut down that nuclear power plant. So we don't just stock it up with, decades worth of grain and other foods, but we also equip it with a fleet of vehicles and equipment necessary to manage the decommissioning and shutting down and safe, I won't say disposal, but safe containment of your waste. Anyway, all that would require a significant investment up front, and I envision, and as we talk about in our 2-hour hangout, it went really long last night, called Homer's Ark, Arcologies for the Future, we talk about ways that we can actually finance that in various different elements of them, and also things that these arcologies can do beyond shutting down the nuclear power plants and decommissioning nuclear warheads and whatnot, notably helping assist species transition from lower latitudes to more northern latitudes, where there will be, climatic and geological conditions for habitat to now emerge for certain species. So if there are some hot climate species that are doing quite well, thank you very much, in certain hot climates around the world, concentrated around the equator. In the hothouse state that planet Earth is moving towards very rapidly, we might have some northern latitudes that could support those species that are currently near the equator. Well, somebody needs to move them from the equator to the northern latitudes, and so the general principle of these arcologies is that they're not just about saving some fraction of humanity, but that they're empowering humanity to do some of the things for Mother Earth that Mother Earth cannot do very well herself. That's the general principle of it. So I'll just recommend that interested folks on these topics watch Homer's Arcologies for the Future, which is on my YouTube channel. But anyway, I'm going to go on mute since I've just said a mouthful.
Well, I listened to that one, and I got my friend Tara too, and both of us kind of reacted the same way about it, as far as your vision of that we'll have to stop, the Mad Max world, but there will be some people in the arcologies and they will need guns to protect it. And it's kind of this militaristic arcology model. And if you look at the biosphere too, you will see that it has all these different biomes that make up the biosphere too, because what you're doing within the biosphere too is creating an atmosphere in order for you to recycle all the gases and to create this mini Earth. And that's what a closed arcology would be, that you'd have to create a mini Earth within the arcology to be able to exist in inhospitable environments, like what the hothouse Earth would be, or going into outer space and living on Mars or in a college or in a space colony. So you need to take all the 5 biological, quote, kingdoms with you, or let's call them queendoms, in order for you to create an artificial atmosphere. And I mean, I've been promoting this idea for a long time, that this network of arcologies, in order for us to have an ark, a place where we can go and survive a climate that we have destroyed, or to be able to lift the human race to other planets. So, I mean, it's just an evolutionary container. And you need to have all these different life forms with you. It's not just humanity in your spaceship. And we do not really know how many species we need to take with us. So all this needs to be experimented with. And we need a test site for this. That's what, if we have nuclear test sites, let's have an urban test site. This is the idea of, I think his name is, he's the one that invented Earthships in New Mexico, a brilliant architect. And that's what he says in one of his films, is that, we need these test sites for how to build the closed ecosystem. That's what the biosphere too was supposed to do. Since that time, originally it was a cult. John Allen was the leader of that cult who started the biosphere too. And the funding was one of the Hunt brothers, who were oil billionaires, who gave the money to create that experiment. Then after they did their experiment, found out that the atmosphere was leaking oxygen. It was being absorbed in the concrete, the foundation. So, I mean, it didn't work. but then other experiments are happening in it now. Columbia University took it over after the cult left, and now the University of Arizona conducts experiments with it on climate change, and also how to create a container that could exist on Mars. So they're working on the Mars mission as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you. Go ahead, Jason.
So I almost wish, Jamin, that I had been invited to that call, because I have written about an arc in my notes, or thought about an arc extensively, because a lot of times when I sort of say going back to what we were originally talking about, the global dimming, I did actually have a full understanding of that. I mean, Guy McPherson touches on it in his recent 20-minute explanation of abrupt climate change, where he says we have these paradoxes. And he sort of describes that, but he doesn't go into detail of it. So maybe this documentary really opened up the details to you, and that kind of made you, but I guess it was something that I already did understand. And so sometimes I feel like, I'm saying that, or even if you try to say it to people, like all the things you see from Greenpeace or all these advertisements online, like stop the drilling, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. I always want to try to bring that global dimming up, and it never really comes off well. People either just ignore you or think you're a nut or whatever. But I do think that if there are people on this planet who want to survive past the next decade of warming, they are going to have to create something like an arc. And it may be too late for us to... I think sometimes people get confused on here. They think that we're trying to save all, 7 to 8 billion inhabitants of planet Earth. I think we all sort of know that may be pretty much impossible. It may be inevitable that, billions of people may die in the coming years from starvation and lack to access to clean water. But that, if we have any chance of sort of cleaning up the mess we've created and surviving on, it wouldn't be like we need one sort of arcology arc. We maybe need a network of them. And, they could even be on ships, for instance, because it might be easier to protect ships. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking about Biosphere 2 in the idea that it didn't work, just like doctors said. They had these things and all, maybe it would have worked, I guess, if they let the concrete cure for longer so it wasn't sucking up the oxygen. But like I've even looked into how many plants, NASA thinks it would take to keep one human being alive in a locked container. And it's about 300 to 500 plants. So, I mean, I would see a biosphere of the future not looking like the beautiful thing that they built in Biosphere 2. I'd almost see it being like shelves upon shelves upon shelves of lights and plants that would have to be grown in order to clean out all the toxins, create enough oxygen, and clean out the carbon dioxide. And I think you would also want to have, like I'm sure space shuttles have different types of machinery, man-made equipment, that helps them balance that. I would think that you would need to have that too in case of an emergency or in case your biosphere isn't working. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that I like this idea of talking about the arc. And I've explored it in my own thought extensively. Maybe at one point I'll get a chance to sort of put that all in a video blog or something. But, I'm on board with you on that. I think that sounds good because I feel like there's two routes, right? There's really trying to get all of mankind on board to really salvage the whole situation. And then there's, maybe some of us could survive on the planet, in some sort of arc society that's closed off from the weather and everything like that. And, but I think they literally have to be things that are built under the ground in some cases and hidden from other people, because Doctor's just right. I mean, if you put it right next to Los Angeles, for instance, and everybody knows where it is, when those 10 million people are starving to death, they're probably going to be like, well, hey, there's that bunker over there where they store all those seeds and grow food underground. Let's go over there. So I think, another idea that comes out of that for me too is that one thing that Guy McPherson is saying is that we'll lose all this grain. If societies or cities wanted to solve the problem now, they could theoretically come together and say, how are we going to grow enough food for our city, our civilization unit here in the city of Los Angeles or the city of Chicago, and inside like controlled climate freight containers or a big thing, we're going to grow tons of food for exactly this purpose for when shit hits the fan. Now, obviously, that's a little more difficult maybe, but that would be one way that you could foreseeably see having some people live through, those really extreme things, is if you can just continue providing food, I guess. Maybe everything doesn't break down and you have a chance to organize people afterwards and sort of say, well, if you're eating this food that's coming from this thing, that you're kind of volunteering your time basically to help us restore or salvage whatever we can, whether that's dismantle nuclear power plants, plant trees, or, not that trees are going to help at this point, but,
Hello?
Came out with a book.
Oh, you were saying? Okay. And the idea is not that they be militaristic per se, but I'm simply acknowledging the reality that Jason identified. These arcologies, in our envisioning of them, they would have stockpiled, decades worth of grain for the inhabitants inside. Because that fact would be very hard to hide from the general public. Starving people with guns would say, hey, there's a lot of grain inside that arcology over there, a couple miles south. And we're really hungry, and I've got kids who I would really love to feed. Let's go bust in there and get some.
Well, yeah, I know, Jamin. I realize that consciousness, and I guess that's just not where I'm headed. And all this catastrophe talk, I think that we should design the arcologies for 7 billion people. How do we migrate into this new civilization pattern for all of us and not exclude people, and have it be a peaceful transition and no guns? This has been the problem of patriarchal civilization, that you don't think about everybody. And just like, you got to have your guns. And I'm sick of it.
I feel, though, that Dan would have a good point to make about this. I feel like there's the religious people in this world and the people who already deny climate change is real. I mean, they may think that we're all nuts up until the minute they're starving to death. Like, even after they're starving to death, they may just, this is what God's will is. And so I don't think you'd ever get the 7 billion inhabitants of Earth to work together towards this arcology. I mean, some people are going to be left behind because they're unwilling to even think about or talk about the issues that we're talking about. I find it hard to believe that, we could save everybody on Earth, but yeah, it's a nice idea.
Yeah, and if I could, clearly, because we're running out of time, and there isn't time to really go into the hoarding censorship part, but I would like to bring up something that I may have brought up last week or a couple of weeks ago. There's this guy, Joe Newbarth, Neubarth. He posts a lot on Facebook, and he has a background. I think he was in the Navy, and his specialty was nuclear, biological, chemical warfare, and he's rather well-educated, maybe partly self-educated in some ways, but he really is knowledgeable, it appears, about what's going on. And one of the things that he keeps talking about over and over again is that he believes that he references wealthy Republican elites, which I think he has been associated with for some period of time, or he has a knowledge of that sector. And he claims that it's been known for a very, very long time that the only way you can really refreeze the Arctic, at least one, is to simply set off nuclear bombs, maybe within volcanoes, but to just set off a bunch of nuclear bombs to create a nuclear winter effect that would refreeze the Arctic and do other things. And that these wealthy Republican elites, and he makes reference to, I think it's the Georgia Guidestones that were put someplace in Georgia back in 1977 or somewhere in that time frame, where it is talking about the necessity to have population down to 500 million people. And, Paul Ehrlich and others might say 1.5 billion or 2 billion. And that what the thought processes are is to let, and especially in light of global dimming issues, to let most of the population in the world die off from global warming changes. And then at a certain point, after, and this would be mostly people in very vulnerable areas of the globe. And then at a certain point, you have these underground shelters, which the wealthy can retreat into. And then, you have the winter come on. He claims that the nuclear contamination from the bombs going off would be at a level that would not be problematic. I have no idea whether that's true or not. But what he's saying is that after maybe a year or 16 months, people could reemerge with a, Arctic that's been refrozen, and they could start a new society or a new world, kind of thing. Now, that may just be a complete fantasy scenario, and there's lots of different ones that are kind of similar to that. But I think that, one of the things that needs to be addressed is, when you go to the Mad Max kind of psychology, where let's say there's a shortage of food in Chicago because, I don't know, the power grid is down or something. But we're not talking about human extinction. We're talking about power grid down in Chicago. There's a shortage of food, and maybe you would have a Mad Max kind of scenario develop, where well-armed street gang members or military people at some point might come in and try to take control. But for a period of time, you'd have anybody who was hungry or wanted food or money or whatever might go ahead and behave in a very predatory fashion. Mostly men, of course. But the thing is, that's one kind of scenario. The scenario where you're actually getting to a point where nobody's going to really be alive, or the few people that would be alive would be living in a relative dystopian hell of some kind. That's a different situation, and there's a lot of ethical issues which could be addressed. So, for example, the issue of the population. If we're at 7.5 billion right now, and that's quite an overshoot from, I think, any rational expectation, and we're going up to, maybe 9 billion or 10 billion by, I don't know, 2050 or so, sometime in the relatively near future, that's a trend which ultimately, if you keep the global dimming going, the global dimming isn't going to be sufficient to stop the exponential temperature rise. And the more people you bring into the world that are living in industrialized economies, the more problematic it is. And you do have a problem with these religious organizations, which a huge sector of the population adheres to. Judaism, not that many Jews, but Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, these religions, to one degree or another, and the cultures that are associated with them, reinforce reproduction. In other words, be fruitful and multiply in some sort of a form. That is something that God, whether it's this God or that God, wants. That is a trend which would have to be discussed, because if you were going to keep more people alive and viable in some sort of way, with being able to somehow cool down the planet without going to a nuclear winter, then we would have to have a reduction in the population through a careful intervention of various various methods of birth control. You could probably, Jamin, you would be somebody who could probably do the math on that. But go ahead, and if people resisted having birth after birth, and there was an economic matrix that could support people when they get a little bit older, so they wouldn't have to be, I got to have 7 children because I'm going to have somebody take care of me. But if these things could be addressed, and you could actually, in a humane way, reduce the population, where we could say, instead of the increase, we're going to actually, over some decades, reduce the population so that we do not continue to have to have more and more of resource shortages. Eventually, it's just simply not everybody's going to be able to survive. And then the question becomes also, I think, is who is entitled to survive? If it's a situation where only a small number of people can survive. And that's something which is, of course, never really talked about, in a public way. But I think it's, it's a significant thing. I mean, for example, and then I'm done. I remember when Fukushima occurred, and they were originally, they got to go down. They had to send some engineers or people who had a certain kind of knowledge down there to assess the damage. It was decided that people, maybe they were people over 60, I don't recall what it was, but people who were older, who had adequate knowledge to do that job, were going to go do it, because it was thought more ethical to allow younger people who could do the same thing to not have to put themselves in that grave danger of the radiation, since the people who were older had already had a good a period of life. And I remember at some point, I hope I'm not inaccurate on this, but I have a memory of being taught that some certain tribes of Eskimos, where they're living in a very resource limited environment, would expect elderly people, when they could no longer, essentially, I would imagine, work and contribute. It was the honorable thing to do, was to go out on the ice and allow the cold temperatures to end your life. And that was just something that was honorable and was expected to do. And I just bring those examples up as certain kinds of ways of handling resource shortages, and having people have a sense that certain things are honorable, and you do not have, maybe you don't need to have so many children if conditions are in place where you would be able to, assuming you could live to old age, you'd be able to be supported in an adequate way. In places like India and Africa, and so many parts of the world, that's not the case. You've got, you better have your children, because when you get old, who's going to take care of you? How are you going to get by? And there's many other issues connected with that. So to be able to have these conversations, people have to kind of pull their heads out of normalcy. The kind of things that are talked about. And I would really hope that, we in this group and other groups could, at a certain point, talk about these kinds of issues. I'm going to a conference in Las Vegas. I think it's the middle of March. I still have to get registered for it, but where it's going to be, it's basically focused on assisted suicide and other issues associated with that. And I think that again, people having some sort of a sense of if things really go bad, where you're suddenly at that moment where, I wish myself and my family, my loved ones could stay alive, but it's just not going to be viable for one reason or another. How do I want to handle that? Do I want to, essentially blow my brains out? Do I want to jump off a roof? What sort of strategy do I have? And the thing that's associated with that, if we are heading into this kind of a world because of exponential climate change, people do have to, and it's connected to what I was just talking about, make decisions about having children. Do you really want to bring a child into the world if you have some sense of the danger at this point in time? Do you want to have to eventually be put in a situation where you're going to have to put your young child down like you would euthanize a dog or something? And these are issues which people don't want to think about, they don't want to talk about, but they're really central to psychologically, emotionally being able to adjust to this reality. It's a completely different environment, and most people are, watching, reality TV and thinking about Trump and Hillary and all of these things, and it's just like, it's like when I was a kid, I used to like watching the Saturday morning cartoons, and it's almost, the same kind of mechanism that goes on. I rarely see anything on mainstream media outlets, television or anything that address. Occasionally you see a movie or something is done. But anyway, that's my last sermon or whatever it is for today. I'm gonna mute out, and I do have to go. And again, just as always, I want to say I really enjoyed the conversation, and I thought it kind of it moved on in a certain kind of interesting way, starting out with you, Dr. Snitopia, kind of going through a certain kind of narrative. I appreciate the conversation. I'm really glad you're back, doctors. I really didn't expect to see you today. It was really a good moment when you suddenly appeared. And so I'm gonna go ahead and sign out. I look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Let me just say, Dan, about the population. What is so good about the network of Arcologies is that it's a physical design, and people can see, hey, there's limited space in that design. And from there, they can go, well, I can't have 7 children anymore because they're not all going to fit in that design. And I think one of the laws within an Arcology is that a woman can have 1 child. That's all. So you're going to pick very wisely who you want to be the parent, the father of that child. So I think that Arcology on many different levels gives us a visualization of the future, that we realize the limited resources we have, and that people will have to change their lifestyle in order to be part of that movement.
I get that. That makes sense to me, but I feel like good luck getting a Mormon in Utah to abide by the one child per mother rule, or Pakistanis in Pakistan.
Well, the important thing for us is to build a model so that we can to show and teach the world that it can actually work. And that's what we're missing right now, is that prototype.
I agree. It'd be great to have a prototype test site.
So anyway, I think I'm needing to go as well. So I will say goodbye, Jamin and Jason.
Bye, doctors. Good to
Great
have
to
you.
see you, doctors. We'll see you next week.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you soon.
Hey, Jamin.
Hey. So, yeah, you know, I think this is the conversation we need to have, because look at the extremes. You know, in the worst case scenario, nobody survives. Life doesn't survive. You know, all the 440 odd nuclear power plants all go Fukushima, and you know, there's no more life. Okay, so that's one extreme. Huge step up from that would be this network of arcologies that would perhaps save only a tiny fraction of humanity that's currently alive today, but set up that fraction, safely decommission as many of the nuclear power plants as they possibly can, enabling the possibility of life to go on planet Earth. And then one notch up from that is to, in addition to decommissioning the nuclear power plants, also, you know, help relocate species and ecosystems to northern latitudes or southern latitudes or wherever life can actually flourish, even in a hothouse state. Some portion of life, right? And humanity may not make it. Even with this network of arcologies, we may not make it. So for me, the goal is not saving all 7.4 billion of us. The main goal is saving life on Earth, and preferably complex life, so that even if humanity doesn't make it, at least complex life has an opportunity to bounce back, and maybe we leave some time capsules. So, you know, so-called intelligent life, clever organisms like ourselves reemerge in the future, be able to learn from our mistakes of hoarding, which is a topic we haven't gotten to yet, and I say we postpone until next week. And you know, anyway, that's my mini brain dump at the end. But I say let's start with the first milestones, get those locked in. And then if we can find some magical way of ecologies to house all of humanity in time, great. You know, I'm not all about mass extinction. But there's so many of us and we have such a massive footprint, it just seems a bit hard to imagine that in the short time that we have before we really start the rocket ship ride to hothouse state, that we're going to be able to, you know, completely reconfigure all of industrial society to produce all these arcologies and relocate everyone into them. I just don't see a way that we're going to avoid Mad Max at this point. So let's fight arcologies to at least decommission nuclear and relocate species and do other things that Mother Earth can't do for herself. Going on mute.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. I mean, I think talking about degrees of that too. You know, we could go on forever of degrees of that. You know, I think if we were to be more successful in doing some of the things we talked about, we would need a lot more people to wake up, and we'd need, you know, maybe governments and countries to actually get behind a real plan of some sort of action plan. But anyway, I think today's been a good day. We've gone over a lot of stuff, but I would, you know, almost agree with you. I don't know if it's, I think the idea that, you know, 7 billion is already an overshoot. It's very clear to most people who understand these different ideas that we talk about and overshoot and It's the idea that there's too many people on the planet, and the planet doesn't have enough resources to really make it happen. And with these many humans, we're overly polluting the atmosphere. And I know there's a lot of people out there who, when you tell them there's too many people, they get upset and they say, "Oh no, we have enough. We could." I saw some lady comment that there's so much available land in Africa that we could turn into agricultural land to grow food to feed populations. But, of course, she doesn't think about the ecological impact of turning all of the free land in Africa into farming land would be an ecological nightmare, a disaster. It would release more CO2 and carbon into the atmosphere than it wouldn't matter how much food you made. So, anyways, I guess we can just close it out now if you want.
Sure. And also, I just wanted to mention, I hereby cordially invite you to all future episodes. We kicked off last night. I just renamed it to Saving Life on Earth, Arcologies for the Future. So I'll definitely ping you for that. We often do them late at night because Michael is in Thailand, and so we just find it late at night Pacific time. Anyway, so yeah, but this has been a great session. Great to see you. Great to see everyone, and I just want to thank everyone for joining and participating, including our audience, who generously submits comments, and please continue to do so.
Sounds good.
Sound good? All right, buddy. Look forward to seeing you next time. I'm going to end the broadcast now. Everyone.